Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Building a Reading Brain. Hope you're all having a great day. My name is Letty Swank, and I work for the Homeschool Buyers Co-op. I'd like to welcome Betsy Hill, a neuroeducator and president of BrainWare Learning Company, for our webinar today. Betsy has studied the application of neuroscience to teaching and learning and works with educators, clinicians, and corporate trainers on using neuroscience research to address some of the most perplexing problems in education. During Betsy's presentation, please feel free to type any questions you may have in the chat box, and we'll get to many as we can at the end. And now I will turn it over to Betsy.
Letty, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today. This is a topic that I have become really interested in recently as we start to really appreciate some of the complexities of what we think of as one of the basics in life, which is reading. So as many of you probably know, reading is really the foundation for just about all formal education, and for much, probably for much informal education as well. But certainly when we're talking about school or college, and even in the workplace, reading is just an absolute essential for that as a primary foundation. We can look at our students' ability to read at the end of third grade and predict future academic success. We can't do that perfectly, of course, and it is possible, absolutely, to learn to read later. But that's an important milestone for many students. In our country, unfortunately, 37% of fourth graders cannot read at a basic level. And that's very, very foundational. And 2/3 cannot read at a level that is considered proficient. And so this has some pretty striking implications for what happens when our students get to college or to the workplace. If readers who really struggle very seldom catch up, mostly because our system doesn't give them the opportunity to do that. It is very possible to do that, but they tend to just drop farther and farther behind, unfortunately. And the statistics are even worse for some student groups. So students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, students with who are English language learners, and students with learning disabilities struggle even to a greater degree than the averages. And I don't know whether you know this, but many states actually predict future prison needs by looking at fourth grade reading rates. So reading, it turns out, is not something that we evolved to do. We can actually call it an unnatural act, an important one, but not one that comes to us automatically. So we've evolved to speak as a species. When we are born, we are going to learn to speak. People, even in a hearing child in a deaf household, will learn to speak. Twins or other children who are growing up together, even if they're not surrounded by language, will develop their own language. And humans have used oral language for at least 250,000 years. I've heard longer, but based on what I've read, it's quite some time. So we're hardwired to speak. Unfortunately, we're not hardwired to read. And that's been the process of reading, that is representing the sounds of language by written symbols, has only been around for about 4,000 years. So it's a much more recent development than the emergence of language. So how do we learn to read when there's no innate pathway, when those structures aren't necessarily there? And the answer to that lies in one of the great discoveries about the brain in the end of the last century and this one, which is that the brain has great plasticity. You'll hear the term neuroplasticity or plasticity, both of which refer to the fact that the brain can change. It can adapt. We are constantly learning. Our brains are constantly changing. And plasticity means that we can start to make connections among structures and networks, neural networks in our brain that are devoted to other processes. So what we do when we learn to read is we actually co-opt, we use and connect structures that were made for language and for vision, and then we have to sort of adapt them. So each brain has to build that connection, build that structure. Unfortunately, our parents can't learn it for us and just pass it on the way they can blue eyes or recipes that they've saved up over their lives. So when we talk about this, about the whole concept of learning to read, what I want to do is dig a little bit deeper down into this whole concept of learning, because this is very relevant here and will help us, I think, understand what's happening when we learn to read. So what I'd like you to do, Letty has already pointed out the chat window to you. If you could just type into the chat window your thoughts about how you would answer the question, what is learning? And think about it. We talk about learning all the time. We're homeschooling. We're very concerned about our children's learning, but what is learning? And I'm going to take a peek at the chat window if I can. Any thoughts about learning that you can share? Ability and tools to get knowledge, mastering a skill, acquiring the ability to gain new knowledge that you retain. Very good. Gaining knowledge. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing those ideas. And those are, of course, very pertinent to learning. But when I think about learning and some of the processes that happen, I think about it as a biological process. So at its very foundation, learning is actually the act of making and strengthening connections among neurons, thousands of neurons, into neural networks or maps in our brains. So when we experience something, there is a group, a network of neurons that is activated in our brains. When we remember something, we don't go pull it out of a vault or something like that. What we're doing is we're actually reactivating the connections that were made at the time that we learned this. So every time we remember, we reactivate. And the more that we activate that set of neurons, starting from that first learning process, through every time we remember it, retrieve that information, and reactivate those neurons, we're going to make those connections stronger and stronger, and therefore easier to reactivate later. So the more we practice, the more we're going to be able to remember. The neuroscientists have a phrase for this that helps us remember, which is neurons that fire together, wire together. And they don't physically wire together, but those connections are more likely to be activated every time we have that experience. So this is a picture of neurons. There are 3 neurons here, as you can see. We have about 85 billion of them in our brains. And they communicate at junctures called synapses. So you can see each of these neurons has one axon. That's that long, taily kind of thing that comes out. And the axon carries messages from one neuron to others. So there are electrical signals that turn into chemical signals at the synapse for each time it's sending a message. The receptive areas of the neuron are called dendrites, and dendrite is based on the Greek word for tree. So it's like the branches of a tree. And while each neuron has one axon, it has thousands and thousands of dendrites. So lots of ways to receive information. And it's these connections that develop that are where all of that communication happens, and it's really the basis for all human behavior. So this is a picture actual of neurons. It's a slide, obviously it's magnified many, many times. You can fit 30,000 neurons on the head of a pin. So that's how you get 85 billion of them into your skull. And you can see all the little dark spots, which are the cell bodies. And then look at all those ways that they connect up and down and across all over that place. Our brains are very, very busy places. They don't start off that way. So here are a couple more images. What we're seeing on the left are neurons in the brain of a newborn, and on the right-hand side, it's a 2-year-old. And so you can see that the newborn has those neurons, but they're not very well connected. They're just starting to branch out and make those connections. Those connections are made at such an incredible rate. It's multiple connections per second from the time that the brain starts developing in utero until year 2. And so this is the one on the right is what it starts to look like then. Now it turns out that the one on the right actually has too many connections. So because our brains develop in interaction with the environment, we are creating those connections with all of those experiences we have. And some of them are going to be useful and really serve us well, and some of them are really not going to be. And so if you also think about some of the things that happen when kids are 2, like the terrible twos, could also be a picture of the terrible twos, but it is really truly a picture of learning, the making and connection, strengthening of connections among neurons in the brain. So when children are born, they can hear the sound of any language. And what happens is that they will respond, and their brains will respond to create those neural connections that represent all kinds of sounds. But those that they hear regularly, that are reinforced, remain, and the others will go away. And in fact, we don't create very much in the way of connections for new sounds when we get older, which is why it becomes much more difficult. By the time that we're about 6 months old, we've pruned away basically all those sounds, the connections that would be used in other languages other than our own. And so it becomes more difficult to pronounce words in other languages. We can learn other aspects of other languages much more easily at an older age than we can pronunciation. However, plasticity exists throughout our lifetimes. Younger brains are more plastic, more adaptable, and change faster than adult brains. But this is not something we should ever give up on, because our brains are constantly changing throughout our lifetimes. So here's, when we talk about neural networks and circuits and structures in the brain that allow us to learn various kinds of things and do various kinds of things, these are some brain images that are very relevant to reading. And so what you're seeing here is these are a type of brain scan called a PET scan. And the areas that are red and yellow and orange and white are the most active. The areas that are blue and green are less active. The white part is drawn in so that you're looking at the front part of the brain on the left and the back part of the brain on the right. So you're looking at it from the right side of the head. Just because there are parts that look black doesn't mean that nothing is going on there. Our brains are always active. All of our parts of our brains are always active. It just means it's not as active as the parts that are lit up or colored here, which are the most active. And so we can see on the top left one, if we have somebody who's just looking at words, just, not reading them necessarily, but looking at them, the back part of our brain is activated, and that's our occipital lobes where we do visual processing. So that makes a lot of sense. When we're listening to words, you can see on the top right image, you can see the areas, it's sort of a little bit above the ears in the temporal lobe, which is where we do auditory processing. So again, that makes a lot of sense. If you look at the bottom left one, we can see activation right at the rear part of our frontal lobes, which is where the motor cortex is. That is where we control all of the activity, and the part that's lit up is the part that's responsible for all of the movement in our lips and our tongue and our jaw and all that facial kind of stuff. And then on the bottom right, you can see two parts that are lit up. And I want you to sort of keep this in mind as we go forward, because these are going to come back. So there's a part in the back part of our brain, it's like the rear of the temporal lobe, which is called Wernicke's area. And we'll look at that again. But that's basically where our vocabulary, our lexicon is stored. And then the front part is the part that's called Broca's area, where we manage the production of speech. So not the control of our lips and our tongue, but everything else that manages the words that we're going to articulate. This is what was happening when people were asked to generate verbs. So that means, for example, if I gave you the word broom, you might come up with a verb like sweep. And so you're really thinking about the meaning of the words, and that's why we have to activate both the parts that control our speech production as well as the meanings of words. So this is just another image with the parts labeled, not a scan, just a drawing, of course, where we see this language pathway, the communication between that Wernicke's area and Broca's area in the front part of our brain. So this is the part that is pretty much hardwired and that we develop automatically as we're exposed to language. In order to learn to read, we have to build onto that, and we have to make a connection that starts back in the occipital lobes, the back part of our brain where we do visual processing. Because of course, we're going to have to take written symbols that we can see with our eyes and somehow get them to connect with words that have meaning in Wernicke's area so that we can produce them in order to read. So as we go forward, I want to just cover a few terms that I think may be helpful for everybody to make sure and if you know this already, that's great. But sometimes some of these terms can sound confusingly similar. And so I think it's hopefully helpful to just spend a little bit of time clarifying them. So one of the terms is a phoneme. A phoneme is the smallest sound of speech that corresponds to meaning or that discriminates one word for another. And it corresponds to a letter or combination of letters in an alphabetic writing system. So if we take a very simple word like cat, the word cat has 3 distinct speech sounds, the k, the a, and the t. And we put them together, cat. So cat has 3 phonemes. We also talk a lot about when we're learning to read, particularly as a pre-reading requirement and as something that can be developed long before children actually start to read, is phonemic awareness. And phonemic awareness simply means that we're aware of these individual sounds or these phonemes, and we're able to discern them and the sequence in which they're said. So, and we start to understand that the same sounds, we can take them and we can combine them and recombine them in a lot of different ways to create new words. So for example, when children can, or any of us can discriminate between cat and bat and sat and mat, all of those words differ by just the first phoneme in the word. That's phonemic awareness. We can also look at it and discriminate the last sound in the word as cab or cam or cap. And then we can play around with the middle sound as well. So we can take cat and we can just change the middle phoneme to cot or cut. And we have, again, different words. And then of course we can take those 3 phonemes and we can mix them up a little bit. We can change the sequence. So the word act has the same 3 phonemes. The word tack, tack, has the same phonemes, but in a different order. Phonological processing is very similar. But it's actually producing and recognizing these sounds and breaking words into syllables and distinguishing parts of words and parts of syllables. So if you can think to yourself, we actually just did this on the previous slide, but words that rhyme with cat. So rhyming words are a part of this. Cat, bat, sat, mat, pat, there are lots of them. And we can think of words that start with cat. We could have cats plural, or catty, or catastrophe, or catacombs, or catch. And when we're able to hear that all of those words contain that cat syllable, that cat sound, that's part of phonological processing. We can think of words that end with cat. There are not many that aren't really based on the word cat, but scat is one of them. Anything that has cat in the middle, I haven't been able to think of too many that aren't just a type of cat, like wildcatting or tomcatting or something like that. But this is the kind of play that you can think of, or I think of when my sister was young and she used to pronounce a particular word lipskit instead of lipstick, or pischetti instead of spaghetti. And that's something where an individual may be hearing the correct phonemes, but not keeping them in the right order. And that may become, we also used to play around with it a lot. My maiden name was Perkins, and we used to enjoy reversing the sounds, which made it snicker, which is, you know, how much fun can you have with that? So all of those kinds of games, so reversing sounds, playing around, all the like Pig Latin games and things like that are great phonological processing activities. And then, of course, we are really going to boil it all down to understanding the symbols that are on paper and being able to decode, which is decipher a new word by sounding it out, and phonics, which is an instructional system. It's a way that we approach teaching students phonemic awareness and phonological processes. So when we develop reading skills, most children go through the same 3 steps. And the first step is referred to as the pictorial stage. This stage usually occurs around ages 5 or 6. It's not formal reading. It's really sort of an artificial form of reading. And this is when, and many of you may have had your children go through this, where they recognize the stop sign and they say, oh, I can read that, it says stop. Or they see McDonald's or Target or some other favorite place and recognize and can say that says McDonald's, or their street sign, or their names. Those are other things. And really what's happening at this stage is that they're not reading the words per se, because you could take those letters and mix them up and they wouldn't be able to make much sense of them. They're reading them, they're recognizing them as though they were a picture, an object, or a face. And in fact, we use the facial recognition part of our brains, part of our visual processing system, is a very important aspect of reading. When we get to that point where we discover that speech is made up of sounds, of phonemes, which can be recombined, that's phonemic awareness, and it generally has to be taught, although kids will sometimes stumble on some of these things themselves and start to play with them, and that's great activity when they start to be really silly with words and create their own. And at this point, when they realize that and they start to be able to decode words, they really are looking at isolated letters and letter groups, and they start to figure out how to start to attack a word. And they're no longer processing the whole word, they're actually processing it sound by sound. And they realize that sounds are represented by letters, which are also called graphemes sometimes, and that those letters actually stand for sounds. Then we get to the third stage, which is called the orthographic stage. And this is when our children generally have a pretty large vocabulary, a lot of words that they know, many words that they can use all the time. And most words at this stage start to be seen again as whole units. And they're processed unconsciously, not sounded out. So if you think of the way that you read now, most of that is going to be not sounding out letter by letter, as we did when we were learning to read, but simply recognizing the word as a whole. And in fact, there's research that says that the time it takes to read a word is not influenced by the length of the word. It's actually determined by how often we've encountered that word. So the more times we've seen it, the more automatic we're going to be. And that automaticity is a key part of building fluency that allows meaning and comprehension to increase. When we're sounding out words, we're really focused on that sounding out. And it doesn't, frankly, leave a lot of room for embodying comprehension and meaning. So once again, here's a picture of the phonological pathway going from our visual system through the parts of our system that are the language pathway. So it's also called the language pathway or the phonological pathway. But we also have to deal, of course, with that issue that English is not always phonetic. In fact, many times it's not. English is actually a very difficult language to learn to read, more difficult than many of them, because we have so many possible symbols, and because the syllables are, we use the same letter to make different sounds. We use different sounds can be made by different letters. A letter alone and by itself, outside of context, really doesn't refer to much of anything in English. So that makes it pretty complicated. And in fact, here's some data that I find absolutely fascinating, which is that for languages that are highly and predictably phonetic, where you've got a symbol that refers to a syllable or a sound that is a letter that it always makes the same sound, which is true of Finnish, German, Austrian, Greek. After a year of instructions, school children read words at very close to 100% accuracy. It gets more complicated the less predictably phonetic the language is. And in English, because of the complexities, only about 35% accuracy is what children achieve after a year of instruction in reading. In fact, I came across something interesting. I came across someone recently that claims to have developed rules for all of the ways to sound out words and for all of the exceptions in English. The estimates are that it's probably 50% or less of English words can actually be sounded out predictably. If you employ some rules, you can get better at that. This person claims to be able to account for 98% of pronunciation in English with rules, and there are 108 of them. So needless to say, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be developing both that phonological pathway and that sight word pathway, because trying to remember 108 rules is not something that's going to be happening, at least early in the process of learning to read. So just to underscore sort of the importance of understanding these two types of pathways that we're talking about, two different types of reading, sounding out, and then sight words. So what happens when we see the word CAT here on the bottom left? If we read it out loud, we hear cat, and then we have in our minds a picture of this adorable little furry feline, and that's great. But think about what would happen if instead of the word cat, we see the word, which we might pronounce if we're sounding it out using the basic sounds and some of the, like we learned that CH makes a ch sound. So if I say yatched, and that's what I hear in my mind, nothing may come to mind. I don't know what a yatched is, frankly. Now I do know this word, so I do know how to pronounce it, but it's very unlikely that if I say that, the word, the idea of a yacht, even if I know what a yacht is, I'm not going to connect yatched to yacht. And so this is a word that's going to have to be simply learned as it is and memorized. And so we have this other pathway, the part that goes directly from our visual system to the area where we produce speech that just takes that word as if it were a picture. We're never going to get involved in sounding it out. And it becomes, we can call that the direct pathway in reading. And so typically, as adults or as good readers, we're going to use both pathways. We're going to use the phonological pathway to sound out words. We're going to use the direct pathway to be able to decode and pronounce sight words. And we have to go back and forth between them. And that requires that shifting in our brain is actually a process called flexible attention or cognitive flexibility. So, what an amazing process. We know that these group of neurons can make new connections. They build these pathways. Every time we acquire a new skill, those connections are different. We actually, this plasticity in our brains has allowed us to develop a reading pathway where none existed before. So when we learn to read, our brains are changed forever, both physiologically and intellectually. We've got these connections that simply did not exist before. So let's now talk a little bit about developing how this process comes about, and really sort of the foundation, and how we as parents and teachers can really encourage the development of the skills that we're going to need to be ready to learn to read. So of course, the language pathway is the basis for this. And so reading is not, has to be, will be most successful if it's based on a really strong foundation of language. So everything that we do to help our children develop language sets the stage for reading. Our babies in utero are already hearing sounds of language, and they're already responding. They certainly respond to our voices. They start to know their mother's voice. And when we're born, we can have the neural underpinnings for every language on the face of the earth. We adapt to the language if it hears it repeatedly. So we want our children to hear language, to hear it used well, to hear lots of different words. And we have to encourage them to all that practice and wordplay. When they're saying blah, 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 that's playing with language and practicing it long before they begin to speak. It's sort of the wonderful term that many use is they're scientists in the crib. They're constantly experimenting. And when they produce that sound, mama and dada, and we get all excited, then their experiment has been tremendously successful, and they will repeat it, of course, which makes us all very happy as mama and dada. So much of this you probably know, but it may never hurts to repeat it. So a literacy nurturing environment comes from parents who talk to their children, parents who read to their children, parents who play word games with their children, parents who listen to their children, parents who play nursery rhymes and songs with children. And the research is very robust in this area, that the amounts and kinds of words that children hear spoken are directly related to how much they talk, the vocabulary they use, and how successful they're going to be in learning to read. So when we start to learn to read, we talked about that, some of the steps in this. So having a good oral vocabulary is really important. So we want, when we see the written word, and we say it out loud, we decode it, we pronounce it like the word yacht that we were talking about a few minutes ago. We want to be able to recognize that when we hear it. And so having a good oral vocabulary is going to be really important. Playing with phonemes, substituting, segregating, manipulating, all of that kind of word play. We used to call it pig Latin. You know, you would say igpe, atenle, where you would take the first letter of the word and move it to the end and put the A sound after it. And there are a variety of languages like that that are very fun for kids to use, that are great play with phonemes. A good phonics program is absolutely critical. Our society went through a stage where, because English is so unpredictably phonetic, many educators gave up on phonics for a period of time, and They used to refer to it as whole language. Well, the evidence is that whole language by itself does not work. And so a good phonics program and a program that includes the development and recognition of sight words as well is going to be very important for developing reading skills. Rules, codes, and sounds to words during reading. So there are some pretty helpful rules in decoding English. Things like the silent E at the end of the word, which makes the vowel say its own name. There are exceptions, but it can get us through a lot of words in the English language where we can be able to pronounce them. And so expressly and explicitly teaching those rules and sounds. And then building up rapidity, the ability to rapidly identify. And so there's a lot of repetition and practice that's going to be required to be able to do this. Our brains, when our brains do something over and over and over again, eventually they will get to the point where they say, I've got this, you don't have to think about this anymore. And it will become automatic. And that's what we want to do, but it does require a fair amount of practice to build that up. So just to emphasize a little bit again, reading is actually two processes, the phonological pathway, the direct pathway. Just because we can recognize words and just because we can build fluency does not automatically lead to comprehension. So we need both of those, but we have to get them to the point where they're automatic so that all the conscious processing part of our brain can be available for understanding content. And then we can also talk about some of the things that are most helpful in comprehension. Before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the sort of the cognitive underpinning for reading. So while we've been talking about decoding and fluency and comprehension as if they were everything to do with reading, there are actually some more fundamental processes. And those of you who are familiar and have attended my webinars before or familiar with BrainWare Safari are probably already clued into some of this. But as we said, we build that decoding part of our brain, and skills like the ability to sustain our attention, to sequentially process, things like that are going to be important parts of decoding. When it becomes fluency, our flexible attention, remember we talked about going back and forth between the phonological pathway and the direct pathway, and processing speed are going to be important. And then we're going to talk now about comprehension, but just want to emphasize that what comprehension requires is a good chunk of something called working memory and a good dose of visualization. So working memory is the ability to hold information in our minds while we think about it. It's our conscious processing. So when our working memory is taken up with decoding and sounding out words, that's what it's filled up with, and we're not going to be comprehending. When we get the decoding to be automatic, then we have room to hold the pieces of information that we're gleaning from the text, to think about them, to relate them to each other, to compare them to what we already know, which is how we give things meaning, to create even a visual image of what we're talking about, which will aid in comprehension. So these underlying skills can be really important, and the more that we can build those and encourage those are also going to support our ability to learn to read. So this little chart just shows a lot of the foundational cognitive skills, those attention and auditory and visual processing skills that are the most foundational, and then building up from there through executive functions to reading, math, and of course everything else that we do. So when it comes to comprehension, here are some things that can really help. First, the first suggestion here is repeatedly reading aloud from the same text. Okay, so why is that helpful? It sounds like it might help build fluency, but what does that have to do with comprehension? Well, if you have a single text, or a text, and you repeat it over and over again, as your child, your student builds fluency, that automaticity is taking over and taking that burden out of working memory and allowing them to think about and to actually comprehend text. So giving them the practice of being able to do that and not just moving on to the next text right away can really be helpful in helping them develop those capacities. Explicit instruction in summarizing, monitoring their comprehension, organizing in some kind of graphic way the information, predicting, so what's going to happen next, or, you know, here's the title of the story, what do you think this is going to be about? Questioning different points of view, if those are available in the text that they're reading. Reciprocal reading and discussion, going back and forth and taking turns. Constructing images. These are all really helpful ways to build comprehension. One of the programs that I think does a particularly nice job of this is something called Literacy Planet. I just want to show it to you really quickly here. So this is an exercise that a student might encounter in the program. It happens to be a little excerpt from Alice in Wonderland. And what would happen is, this is the part of the story, most of us are hopefully familiar with this because it's, I remember it so vividly from when I was young and first reading it. It's the part where Alice encounters the caterpillar, who is not particularly enthusiastic about meeting Alice, and they have a conversation. And so after reading this relatively short excerpt, then what the student does is look at questions. And so these are the kinds of questions that are really helpful in comprehension. And we talked, for example, about summarizing. So summarizing includes, you know, what is the main idea? And so here we get a question about the passages, mainly an argument, a script, an interview, a conversation. And in fact, it's a conversation. So if we choose that one and we can tell that we got it right. Here we have conclusions and inferences. So these are the kinds of things that help develop deeper comprehension of text, not just the recall of details, the recall of facts, but things like, and I'm not going to try to get this right, I'm just going to move on so that we can get a couple more examples of this. Here's about predicting. This is predicting what a word that they may not be familiar with. And again, I'm getting this wrong, but that's okay. And another one of comparing and contrasting. So all of these, every text that the students encounter in the program is accompanied by these exercises that help them examine the text from a variety of perspectives that really tend to promote great understanding. And I don't know why I've got my email there. I really don't want that today right now. All right, so I would love to be able to answer some questions now. And while we're doing that, I just wanted to include the link here that actually goes to the information on Literacy Planet on the Homeschool Buyers Co-op site. So Letty, have we got some questions?
I think people are thinking.
Well, that's a good thing. Maybe we should have a test and we should say, what is the main idea? That's not a bad idea. To think about what are some of the key concepts that you've encountered in this webinar.
Yeah. I do have the first question. So how do these steps relate to children who have hearing loss from birth?
So I am not an expert in this field, but I do so when children, then there's going to be a difference because sometimes children have hearing loss from birth and do not recover any of it. And that's going to be a little bit different from children who have hearing loss but are able to be assisted via the technologies like cochlear implants and things like that, where they do start to perceive. And then it's going to be, but a deaf child actually uses the parts of the language system that would be otherwise dedicated to language are just going to be interpreted a different way. So sign language, for example, is going to be really important to help them with basically the signs and symbols of signing are like syllables and phonemes and things where they can be combined and recombined. And so we're using just a different aspect of our processing, our visual processing, to substitute for that auditory.
Okay, we definitely are getting a lot of questions here, Betsy. So should I give you the next one?
Absolutely.
Okay, so any advice to young toddlers that are trying to learn to read? My son is 3, and he has read a book already, actually with phonemic awareness. And I think, yeah, that was the full question.
Well, so some children do learn to read essentially by themselves, and I was one of them. I was reading before I ever had any formal instruction in school. And so that does happen, and I would just let them read what they want to, how they want to, encourage it, be thrilled every time they want to read you the same book over and over again. Sometimes children will read the same book over and over again, and they've memorized it. So actually before I could sound words out, I could read The Little Red Hen was my favorite book, and if my parents read it to me, I would correct them if they skipped a word or made a mistake, and I could read it out loud to them, and I thought it was wonderful. And of course, I read it over and over and over again. And it may not be as much fun for you as reading a variety of different books, but it's wonderful for them, all that repetition. So encourage that. Encourage them to read aloud. Encourage them to, there are lots and lots and lots of graded, readers that this is like step 1, step 2, lots of short chapter books that kids really love to read. And there are a lot of online resources where you can find them. So that's what I would say about that. And if your child isn't reading when they're 3, don't worry about it. My 5-year-old granddaughter is learning to read, and she did some reading to me, and then she would get tired at some point because that's hard work. It's mental exercise, so you do get tired. So encourage it, but give them breaks. And I would say also be really aware when you're encountering words that are not predictably phonemic. If you know that a word can't be, like yacht, can't be pronounced by sounding it out, don't encourage them to sound it out. You can tell them some words don't follow the usual sounds that we know that letters make, and we just have to learn them. We just have to sort of memorize them and give them some opportunities to recognize those sight words, things like the. You're not going to sound we want to teach that as a sight word.
Yeah. Okay, well, and sort of to follow on from the very first question, any kind of advice for children who have autism or some other kind of learning difficulty?
That's such a hard one because the autism spectrum is so varied. It's pretty hard to, within that area, I would say you really should be talking to an expert in autism and in language. So there you're a speech pathologist or some other expert in autism may be very, very helpful. For many students with learning disabilities and some with autism, building up those underlying cognitive skills can be very helpful. So if we go back to the this little chart, things like working memory, cognitive flexibility. So BrainWare Safari is one example of programs that really help work on that. And while they're not instructing reading, they actually help build those underlying capacities, which can be really important for children who, for whatever reason, and there are a gazillion reasons, haven't developed them to the level that's really going to make it easy for them to learn as their more typically developing peers do.
Okay, here's another one. My daughter is 7, and when I ask her to read a simple sentence, she often improves it by adding details that are not there. As in, she decides to make the story better. How can I encourage her to actually read the words in front of her?
Boy, you sure don't want to discourage that wonderful creativity. I think that I might be tempted to say, well, I love the way that you presented that story. Now let's think about how you can do this every time when you're writing. And let's take the story first exactly the way it's written, and then let's see how many ways we can make it better. I don't know if that will work, but that's sort of the direction I would try and head in. Or the other way to do that is to take a sentence and chop it up, cut the words out on a piece of paper and arrange those words into that simple sentence, and then have some other pieces of paper where you can add all those other words that she wanted to add, maybe in another color. Play around with that.
Great. Okay, so another one. At the beginning, you stated some statistics about 3rd and 4th grade. What if a child is past this age but still behind in reading? How do these steps concur with older children?
Well, as I said, that is how our education system sort of measures things, and it doesn't mean that you can't learn to read at an older age. If a child is not reading at 3rd or 4th grade and has had good phonics instruction, has had good reading instruction, has been read to, and all those things, then it's pretty likely that there's something else going on. It could be an underlying learning issue with a weakness or something in one of those cognitive skills. It could be the ability to distinguish phonemes or to correlate written symbols with sounds. So there can be a lot of things that are going on there. Here again, talking to somebody who can help figure out exactly what that might be. So there are, and there are some programs. So if the difficulty seems to be with decoding, with pronouncing words, then there are programs that can help focus on that. There's a very interesting program that we are working with now called Readable English. If anybody's interested in that, we can provide some information. If it's more an issue of fluency, then my guess is that working on cognitive skills and just plenty of practice. If it's comprehension, again, cognitive skills combined with just a lot of practice so you can sort of try to, if you can pinpoint it all where the issues come from, then that can help you. And you may need some professional help if it's a complex kind of a situation. But if you can at least pin it down to, okay, this sounds like it's a phonics problem, a decoding problem versus a comprehension problem, that can be really helpful in directing you where you should go.
Thank you. And that actually covered a couple more questions, which was great, that answer.
Okay.
So here's another one about learning differences. So can you explain how this would be different with a child who has dyslexia?
So there are a lot of types of dyslexia, a lot of levels of dyslexia. There are some things like the ability to keep letters and sounds in the right order that are sequencing kinds of issues. And there you would want to work on some of that phonemic awareness, substituting sounds. You might also consider BrainWare Safari, which is going to work on some of those sequencing and building working memory, building attention skills and things like that. If it's the correlation of sounds and that kind of thing, then explicit phonics instruction. Sometimes if it's, there are aspects of dyslexia which can be related to the actual ability to hear the sounds correctly. And then there are other programs that might focus on that. So a lot of dyslexia, if you can, between building cognitive skills and having a really good, solid phonics program, probably going to address at least half of just based on the kinds of conversations I have with folks who deal in this area. It's going to deal with a lot of dyslexia, maybe half of it, and others may require some specialized intervention.
Okay, next question. Is there a way to help my student move from phonological reading to orthographic?
Practice, practice, practice. Yeah, you do that. That's building up fluency and practicing it over and over again. Taking common sight words and making games out of them or flashcards out of them, and doing that so you're building up that automatic instant recognition. Those kinds of things have been helpful. You don't want to do too much drill and kill because you want people to remember, you want especially our kids to remember that reading is about understanding. But developing some automaticity with some of those kinds of things could certainly be helpful. And it's just lots and lots of practice.
Okay. This was a question might have been covered. How do you encourage a child who has good reading fluency but lacking in comprehension?
So then you really want to do the kinds of things that we were talking about when I was showing Literacy Planet, which is starting with a variety of questions and helping them go back, find information. You can start with some specifics, start with some of the lower level understanding. Who is the character? What did they do? Having them work through sequences of events, have them doing prediction, all of those kinds of things. And the other thing that can be really helpful here is to do a little preview of the reading before they do the reading, thinking about maybe if there's some more difficult vocabulary, which they may be able to sound out but may not be familiar with, you might talk about and work on that before you read it. You might read the first sentence and stop and summarize, frequently as you go through the text, so that you don't just get to the end and hope that they remember some of it. I would say those would be some keys.
I have heard that literacy skills benefits or with certain physical development. What are your thoughts or suggestions on what to build
on? So reading and physical development?
Yeah. Or improvements in literacy skills?
Well, I guess I'm not sure that I know the research in that area very well. But I would say, first of all, we know that physical exercise is really good for all of us, for kids in addition to adults. I think that probably There are aspects of physical activity that can correlate really well with reading skills. So for example, having, especially if you've got a group of kids, giving each of them a letter and having them get into the right order to spell the word. So incorporating, physical actions and things like that. Sometimes there's some very effective programs that have different physical gestures and things like that for sounds or for letters. Those are wonderful. The more you can incorporate multiple modalities into any of these learning processes, the more helpful it's going to be.
Okay, another question is, this child has the opposite problem where great comprehension but low reading fluency, and he doesn't have a strong desire to read. What should I do?
That is a puzzle. So this is a kid who gets the gist and probably gets lost in the forest of the trees of the letters. And I would guess that this is a child who is probably very frustrated by the fact that English doesn't follow rules very well. And they want to understand it. And so it gets in their way. I want to think about that a little bit more, but one of my first reactions is there's a program called Readable English that helps make the decoding more phonetic. It's sort of like I think a child like that might have it'd be really interesting because it's sort of like a code that helps them decode and get to the comprehension part more quickly, which may be less frustrating. And then the other thing about this is just whatever really high interest materials, whatever that child is interested in, we always are going to do better, and they're going to do better if we give them something they really care about reading and getting into.
Okay, and there's a tip from one of our attendees. So Read Aloud Revival is a great website for reading lists and ideas on how to engage children in the joy of reading, which leads to greater comprehension and family fun.
Excellent.
And then we do have,
and families that read together. I mean, it's great, getting everybody in the act. That's wonderful to make it something where people can, where families can read together and discuss things and really start to probe. And when children start to really see that the written word expresses ideas that are worth talking about and that they can really engage with their families, that they contribute with different perspectives than the rest of the family, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I think we've touched a little bit on, verbal reading aloud to your child, but also audiobooks, this member is suggesting. Okay. And then this is actually an interesting fact. I guess the founder of IEW, which is a very popular writing program, had a child who didn't read until he was 12 years old. And he now has a rich vocabulary and really loves reading. Okay, so the last question, I think, so we can wrap up, is a question actually on Literacy Planet, which is there a pretest for Literacy Planet, or do kids just work on their grade level directly?
You can do it either way. There is an assessment that's built in that will give you some indications. A lot of times what people do is simply lock in the grade levels for your student at a grade level below, a grade level above, and the grade level they're at, sort of like a 3 grade level span, so that they're working in that range. And then you can adjust that as it goes along. But there is an assessment also that you can use to figure out where they fit.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that wraps up the Q&A part of the webinar. So Betsy, on behalf of the co-op and our members, I just want to thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And then to all our members who did attend, Thank you very much for spending this hour with us. And then if anyone is interested in either Literacy Planet and or BrainWare Safari, which was mentioned for cognitive skills development, we do have special bonuses in the next week that are ending of 1,000 smart points. So, and as you know, you can use smart points on the co-op website to buy other curriculum as well. So thank you for sharing your time again today, and hope the rest of the week is great.
Thanks, Letty.
Okay, Betsy, talk to you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.